Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be doing this podcast episode today. I am here with my friend Celine Nguyen, and we are going to be chatting all things literature, AI, how to be a creative and an attentive consumer of art and literature in the age of the internet. I was inspired to have this conversation because these days I read so much panic about the literacy crisis, about waning attention spans, and why technology is making everything worse. Sometimes when I think about it too hard, I feel like a doomer as well. And I really wanted to talk to somebody who I admire a lot, who has managed to not only retain their engagement with art and culture and literature, but actually deepen it with the help of the internet and with the help of social media. So, my friend Celine Nguyen is a writer, a software designer, and a literary critic who writes the Substack Personal Canon. I think we first met via the Substack's comments section, and then we're in sort of an SF writing circle together before she moved to London. But I am so excited to have her on the podcast today. Welcome, Celine.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. I'm quite excited because I feel like the range you have for the podcast in terms of like technologists, creatives, media people, academics has been really great. So happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, I think the question I really want to start with is that you have said that the mission of your Substack, Personal Canon, is to quote unquote expand the market for literature.
Mm.
I really like that you frame it this way, and I would love for you to tell me more about what that means.
I'm glad you like the framing. So I'm 31 now. For most of my 20s, I was very, very much immersed in Silicon Valley startup language. So like obsessing over a total addressable market was just like a very familiar thing. And something I found fascinating when I did an MA at the Royal College of Art in London, halfway through my 20s, going from like this very CS tech Silicon Valley world into this more arts and humanities world is like when you're in the tech world, it just feels like things are always expanding, things are always getting better and better. There's more technology penetrating every aspect of society. Whereas in the arts and humanities world, there's this kind of feeling of decline. It's like funding is shrinking. A lot of tenure track positions in arts, like in arts and humanities departments. As professors are retiring, they're not being replaced. There are all these scare stories about how fewer people are majoring in the arts and humanities and things like that. So I think just that shift from like this world that is constantly growing to this world that feels itself to be contracting and under threat was so interesting to me. And I am curious about like what it takes to bring that kind of optimism and that feeling of expanding possibility into the humanities. I went to undergrad and studied computer science. I learned to code as the memes always tell people to do. And then when I became more interested in literature, history, philosophy, and so on, I just felt like I had this incredibly like intellectually expansive period of my life. So I feel that there are a lot of people who are interested in the humanities. And so it's kind of about figuring out like how do you bring more people into the fold and make a pretty like strong case for it.
Mm. What was it that propelled you to go from the world of Silicon Valley to thinking, I want to go to art master's school in London in the first place?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've been referring to that period as my quarter life crisis period. I I met a newsletter reader recently who was also in the throes of his own quarter life crisis.
Mhm.
So I am very interested in, I think in my case, and this might be true of a few other people, it's like it becomes very easy to go through a very specific track where you're like, especially in the US, it's like, I
Mm.
want to be in a certain discipline. I want to be in a certain profession. I better choose the exact right undergraduate program for that. I better choose the exact right starting job outside of college. And then you get funneled into that. And then you're kind of like, okay, wait, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. Where is the self-actualization going to happen? When am I going to feel like fully content with my life and fully individuated? And I think those end up being the questions that people turn to artistic, cultural, philosophical, like humanistic pursuits often to try and answer.
And did you have imposter syndrome at all when you were going to art school for the first time?
I definitely did. I feel like I've only shaken off that feeling maybe in the last year, but I still have quite a lot of it like stuck to me. It's just like every discipline has a different set of reference points. So like if you're an 18-year-old who's just enrolled in a CS program, like you'll hear people around you making jokes about like different sorting algorithms and they'll be like, "Oh, bubble sort, don't use that." And it's like all these little memes that everyone is just sort of expected to know. And if you don't know them, then you have this edge of fear where you're like, oh my God, am I supposed to know that? Am I supposed to know the details of how like JavaScript typing is really annoying and upsetting to use? So every discipline has those in jokes. And so I think what I experienced was this feeling of like, oh, there's this set of reference points, this set of proper nouns that people who are in this other world, like a lot of the people that I did my master's with, I would say about a third of them had done like art practice disciplines. And then there are a lot of art historians, a lot of like historians. And I didn't realize that Walter Benjamin was this person that everyone knew and everyone had read. I felt like I had to do a lot of reading to catch up. I felt very intimidated, and I think that has shaped a lot of how I write my newsletters, where it's like,
Right.
I want to tell people, like, this is the background context. If you don't know it, it's okay. There's this tension of like, you want to instruct people if they don't know, but in a way that's not condescending. And there may
Yeah.
also be an audience that is familiar with this. So trying to find the right balance, I think.
Right. I want to get into the stuff about your newsletter because I
Mhm.
do think that approach shines through in the way that you write your own work. But one of the things that I admire about you is that you just do have crazy discipline for like, I believe that I can master this new field. So, like, can you tell people about how you did get yourself up to speed on all of these theorists and people who you hadn't heard of? Like, you did go and learn the proper nouns and made a dedicated effort, right?
I did a lot of reading that was not very strategic. So maybe as an example, I feel like in the arts and humanities, everyone references Marx and everyone has like some vague sense of like dialectical materialism and things like that. Dialectical materialism, as an aside, being that thing that I Google like once a week just to be like, do I understand what this
So
is? And I'm
real.
still not convinced. I know. When will it stick in my brain? Um, but I remember doing things like Marx is an important reference point. I'm going to start reading Capital. And I was taking really, really exhaustive notes. I was reading Marx's Capital, some translation, and then I was reading the David Harvey guide to it. And then I was just like, okay, this is way too comprehensive. I'm going in way too deep. I'm not actually going to read all of Capital. I don't really need to do that. So there's a lot of like reading ambiently around and not knowing how to get situated in the discipline. There's a reason that people go through rigorous and kind of formalized education is that it is so useful for someone to write the syllabus for you instead of you kind of picking up all the names that are referenced, not knowing if you should read like all of that person's work, if there's just like this one excerpt that people reference all the time. One thing that I think was kind of funny and demystifying is like with Marx, it's like people are always tweeting, arts and humanities people are always tweeting about like, oh, the bolts of linen and like, these little like in jokes. A lot of those things happen very early on in
Oh,
Capital,
that's
those
so
reference
funny.
points.
Oh, that's so
Like
good.
when people reference the Proust Madeline thing, that's like in book one. There are all these other books
Right.
that are after that. So I think there is something demystifying to going straight to the source and realizing that it is not that everyone else in the world has read all of those things very deeply. Sometimes people are also just making a show of knowledge, which is different than actual knowledge. And I don't mean to say
Yeah.
that everyone is a pretender, but it's like for people who are very kind of sincerely trying to learn and feel intimidated, it's very demystifying to be like, oh, okay, I can
Yeah.
access this.
It's so funny
Um,
because I feel
yeah,
like my college experience was almost the opposite, where my high school experience was me Googling dialectical materialism over and over because I was like in
yeah,
into critical theory in the way that like 15-year-olds are into critical theory, which is like not very
yeah,
deeply, but I was trying my best and earnestly. And then I go to Stanford and I'm like in Silicon Valley all of a sudden. And I remember my approach my freshman year because I felt like so impostery and I felt like everyone thought I was so stupid because I didn't know what TAM was I went and read like all of the Silicon Valley books. Like I read Zero to
yeah.
One and The Hard Thing About Hard Things and like every single PGSA. And I would just like nonstop listen to podcasts because I was like, oh, this will teach me the lingo. I think it is a good character building experience to be the kind of person who like knows how to get dropped into a new context and learn the codes. And I think it probably does make one maybe a stronger communicator when we are then trying to communicate about these scenes to the rest of the world. Because in a similar way to how you are trying to make literature more accessible with your writing, I feel like I am often doing storytelling or sense making about strange Silicon Valley cultures now.
I think something you do well in your writing, and I think this is also kind of the value of just dipping into all these disciplines and these kind of like little kind of worlds that all have their own vocabulary, their own kind of canonical texts, and so on, is like just trying to figure out how to translate. It's like this term means this in this world, not just describing the surface level, like this is the stuff people are saying or doing, but like here's the underlying ideology or philosophy or worldview that is transmitted by this.
Mm.
In Silicon Valley, like people do think of disruption as inherently good. They do
Yeah.
think of information as like inherently kind of abstracted and decontextualized. And some of this comes from the kind of like philosophical origins, maybe of like how data structures work, how algorithms work, how like you can abstract away from like what is the specific data and just think about how to handle it and how to store it. And I think there are many ways in which you can critique that and be like, oh, that leads to tech people barging their way into fields where they don't understand the context, where they make a lot of mistakes. But I think there's also this positive ideological aspect of like tech people believe that they can like take these tools and try to solve problems in a lot of different fields. And again, like that has both a positive and a negative side. But I think being able to explain like, why is it that tech people are always trying to get into like health tech and like urbanism
Mm.
and all this stuff, staying in their
Yeah,
lane?
yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think that is a good transition to one of my next topics, which is the celebration of amateurism in a way that I think comes through in the way that you approach your work. So, one of your most popular pieces is Research as Leisure Activity. I was rereading it in preparation for this conversation, and I saw that it went viral on Substack among like literary folks, and it
Yeah.
also went viral on Hacker News among, like
Yeah.
engineers and tech people. And I think that sort of demonstrates this bridge that we're talking about. But what is cool is that your piece is not about engineering, it is about doing research on these more humanistic topics. And I read it as an ode to amateurism, as something that is worthy even in the face of the ivory tower and these like deep layers of text and references that people aren't necessarily coming in with a context on. And then I also saw as a celebration, maybe implicitly, of the internet, actually, as something
Yeah.
that like lowers the barriers to doing personal research. I'm curious if you feel that that's an accurate representation.
Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful summary. And I think what you emphasize at the end, like, it is, I think, a love letter to the kind of intellectual work or the kind of intellectual curiosity that the internet makes possible. When I think about my interest in literature, a lot of it was very much facilitated by the internet. Like, I did not grow up in a New Yorker household. My father, like many Eastern Bloc fathers, grew up reading Tolstoy, like grew up reading a lot of these classics, but then he didn't necessarily read a lot of that literature like later on in his life, especially when he was raising me and my sister. And like my mom too was like introduced to that stuff, but we weren't a literary household, I would say. And so a lot of the books that I now think of as kind of foundational to maybe how I see the world, to my aesthetic worldview, my ethical worldview, I just found about because like people would post on Reddit about it or like people would post on Twitter about it. And I think that is something really special about the internet that you do not need to be in the right like family context, geographic context, social context, where these things are automatically accessible to you. You can just sort of discover your interests online. There's so the sociologist Zeynep Tufekci, she has this TED Talk where she talks about how YouTube encourages political extremism. She has this funny line where she's like, no matter what you're interested in or no matter what you care about, you're never extreme enough for YouTube. Like if you watch a video about vegetarianism, it'll show you a video about veganism. And she was making this point that like people talk about YouTube as tracking people to certain political, like you're like a little bit conservative and then you turn into an alt-right person. But this kind of push into the extremes happens in so many parts of the internet. And obviously, many situations in which that form of radicalization can be bad. But I think it also means that you can develop this kind of like intellectual radicalization where you're kind of like, ooh, I want to know what book I should read. And then, 2 years later, you're a Broderness and you're like, I need to get my hands.
Is this you?
Yeah, that's basically what happened to me. It's like, why am I sitting around like spending all my time talking to people about how much I love Mircea Rescue? Like why did I hear about this writer? It's just because I read some Reddit post about him.
Yeah,
There's no one in my life
radicalization
introducing
for
me.
good and for cultural edification.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe that is what I hope I can do with my newsletter is just kind of be like, do you have some free time? Do you want a book to read on your commute? Have you considered In Search of Lost Time? I mean, that's not like the first book, but like leading people into this world that I think has so much richness and value.
Yeah, I'm curious, what did you make of the response to that piece? Like, how did you feel like reading the comments and seeing that it resonated so much and with which communities?
Oh my God, it was very I mean, obviously really gratifying. I think the thing that was funny about it, maybe just like a thought about writing effort in general, like writing on the internet really feels like constantly playing some kind of mysterious roulette game. I think Venkatesh Rao kind of describes it as like in the same way, like with your investments, you don't want to time the market. And you just kind of assume that you should like invest a lot of money and then kind of like over time, hopefully receive like good investment returns. He's kind of like, that's what you should do with your creative work. You should just like constantly release things, constantly publish things because you don't really know what will hit with people. I've
Yeah.
definitely written things where I was like, "This was amazing," and it got, like, a little bit of attention, and then that thing I dashed off very, very quickly, and it got a lot of attention. It's probably, like, the most, like, popular, widely circulated thing I've done. I think there's this funny thing where, like, it didn't take that much raw time to write, but a lot of the ideas in it were probably distilled from, like, years of reading
Yeah.
random hobbyist
Yeah.
internet blogs, where I'd be like, there's this random person who's just, like, really, really into Japanese interior design, and there's this random person who's really into, like, men's fashion and, like, exactly where a tie should hit, um, and that kind of thing. So, I was thinking about a lot of those random hobbyists online and how I really feel that so much of the internet and content that does not feel like slop, that actually feels like it's emanating from this like very distinctive subjectivity, this distinctive consciousness. A lot of that comes from people who are just like really obsessed about this thing and they really want to share it with you. And so I think I put all of that into this piece. I kind of just like tossed off and then I was like, whoa, this really resonated with people.
I do notice that about my writing as well, where it's not necessarily the number of hours that I spend writing the piece, but there is something about the number of hours that the ideas have been marinating in it or that like it draws from over time. There have certainly been pieces I've dashed off that have done well, but once I really look at it and I think about it, I'm like, actually, yeah, this pool of references, the ideas have been there for quite a while. This sort of brings me into one of the critiques that a lot of people make of the internet's effects on the culture industries, right? Which are that it promotes audience capture or values capture, that seeing all these metrics, seeing the likes and views and whatever, and knowing very viscerally, very immediately what kind of response you're getting to your work and seeing the gap between how proud you feel of your creative work and how the audience receives it. I'm interested in how, as a writer, you make sense of what role metrics play in your own work, as well as a critic, how you look at the effect that these things have on the culture.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the first part. I would almost frame it as like you as a creative person are trying to defend yourself against this encroachment of numbers that will measure whether your work is worth it or not. Like, the number of likes is not actually how worthy your writing is, but it really feels like that's the case.
Mhm.
And there's this balance of obviously you want to be receptive to feedback. I mean, it's valuable to know what lands more with people and what lands less. But like when all reactions are filtered through like the number of views, the number of likes. There are pieces I've read where like the number of likes comes from having like a very, very zingy headline. And it's not to say that
Totally.
writing
The
a good
headline's like the
headline.
tweet. That's kind of how I think about
Yeah.
it. Like, there's certain pieces where you read the headline and it functions as a tweet, and then you just hit like immediately.
Yeah. And you're like, that's it. Yeah. And like, I think there's this funny balance too, where it's like, because some writers get way too purist about it. And they're like, I don't want to have to package my work up for the masses and for the hordes. And I don't want to like optimize for clicks. And I think that kind of thing is so craven and crass. And I kind of see it as like, if you really believe in the quality of your work, like you owe it to your work to try to package it in a way where it can reach the most people. Like there's obviously a way to do it that is very like clickbaity and growth hacky and kind of trashy. But then there's also a way to do it that's just like, are you backing your own work? Like, do you believe that it's meaningful to people? So there's this awkward balance of like, you want to sort of market your work, but then you also want to retain some purity. But specific to the writing itself, I have all these like weird rituals where it's like I use Arc as a browser and I have it customized so like a lot of the numbers don't show up. When Substack sends me those emails that are like, it's been 24 hours since you sent your newsletter, here's how well it performed. I do not read those. I've
Yeah.
never opened them.
As you know, I used to be a product manager at Substack, and
Yeah.
some of these emails, some of these dashboards and analytics I built. And I was like, I think we should have these. And this is where we're going to
Yeah.
put them. And we're going to make sure to like put it in front of writers' faces. And, we read the feedback that people didn't like it. To be clear, there are other people who really wanted this stuff, who wanted stronger analytics. So competing user demands. But it's so funny because at the time, I'm like, well, like, don't you guys like want to know your business stats or whatever? And now that I write full time on Substack,
You're
I'm
like,
like that
no.
person. I'm like, I never look at my revenue chart or subscriber chart ever. Like, I do not want to know. It is not good for my psyche.
Yeah, totally. Last year, I'd see people post Substack notes that are like, I sent out this newsletter and I lost 30 subscribers, but you know what? Like, if you don't believe in trans rights, like, good riddance. And I will say that being able to directly do that cause and effect thing, assume like I did this thing and it had this result. I'm going to now like obsess over why that is. I think it's really unhealthy. I've always tried to avoid
Totally.
doing that. Like the Substack dashboard where it shows you number of subscribers. I have an art boost that hides that, and then I turn it on like once a week. I have journal entries where I'm like, do not look at your numbers until the end of the month. I obviously want to be read, but I think some of the best work I've done has been like, like I wrote a 10,000 word newsletter last year about how I think about AI and art. That's kind of an
Yeah.
insane thing to do. And it probably got like fewer likes and views and so on than a lot of my other stuff. But I think I had this feeling of like, it will mean so much to me intellectually if I can write something that encompasses all of my complicated, conflicted, excited, nervous, fearful feelings and thoughts about how AI will affect art. And so I think it's important to protect yourself from stats so that you can preserve a certain independence to do those things which are like for you and of personal significance.
I think that's real. And being able to think, I am proud of this piece and I remain proud of it, even after it was not received, maybe in the way that I wanted it to be received, at least legibly. Like, I think that is a really important thing. I also totally agree on the unsubscribes. Like, one
Yeah.
debate that I remember having when I worked at Substack was whether or not we should notify people or make more clear how your post
Mm.
drove unsubscribes. And I was like, I don't think that's good, partly because it's demoralizing and it will make people
Yeah.
write less and like that's bad for our metrics. But also like as a creative, like I think it really traps you. It makes you less experimental. It means that you won't be able to pivot or to try new styles. I just don't want to share the negative feedback, not because I'm trying to hide it. You can turn on unsubscribe notifications if that is helpful to you. But I think that for the vast majority of writers, it will make their creative capacities much more constrained. One thing I do want to ask about though is like what metrics that you do value. For example, like I do look at my metrics, but the ones that I know that I really care about are after I wrote something, do I get like emails or notes from people
Mm.
who I really respect? That's actually the thing that makes me really happy where even if a post doesn't do quote unquote like well from a likes or an aggregate views standpoint, if like one or two people who I admire, who I think are really good thinkers, if they send me an email or a note about it, then I'm like, actually, yeah, that was a good one. Or also link backs are something that I look at a lot. I really like the feeling of participating in a discourse. I think that's what makes
Yeah.
internet writing in particular really wonderful to me is whether it is critique or whether it is like celebration. I love the fact that people link to each other's vlogs all the time and you can like create micro discourses this way. So, yeah, I'm curious like what metrics that you actually do track and find valuable.
I think we're very aligned in this, honestly. I also love the feeling of discourse, of like a conversation moving back and forth, of there being an actual community. I almost want to arbitrarily divide the internet into like the social media model of communication and then the forum model.
Mm.
And the forum model is more like you're one person among many other people. Like some people are like cooler posters on the forum or like older, more experienced. But in general, there's this idea that you're all on an even playing field. It's like all your posts show up at the same size. And you're also like all speaking in this shared space. And then I think the social media model is more like there's someone who is like the creator, and then they have their
Mm,
fans, and they're projecting to their fans. And it's very one way. And like obviously, fans can kind of be in the comments, maybe they can repost and elsewhere. But that hierarchy is very endemic to the social media model.
totally.
And I don't know, I just really don't like it. I don't know if some of it is this social insecurity of like, I for most of my life was a very shy person and was very shy online, like up until I started my Substack recently. So I've never felt I would be the person who would be heard in the social media model. But I think a lot of writing is inherently communicative. And the most gratifying part is like receiving the thoughtful comments, is receiving the like email replies in my inbox, is seeing like someone like quote my thing and like add on to it and elaborate on it. And I think I feel really touched by those. What sustained me early on in a lot of my writing was this feeling of I was sending out newsletters that I would put a lot of time into. And I had a relatively small audience, but then I would have a handful of people come by. It would be like people whose newsletters I read, and then they would comment on mine. And they would be like, oh, that book sounds amazing. Have you looked at this? Like, I have learned a lot from people emailing me or replying and introducing me to new ideas or perspectives. And I think that feeling of putting something out there in the world, it has touched someone else. They're communicating back to me. They also have a chance to shape me and shape my thinking. I find that part really precious.
I think you're also a very generous participant in this sense. Like, I can tell that you believe in this very horizontal form of participation because you too are a very thoughtful commenter. You're a generous reader of people's work. You really engage with it. A lot of your own Substack notes, for example, are celebrating other writers and things that you've been reading.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, one little like growth hacky thing Substack does that I do love is notifications. There are like 5 people subscribe to this other newsletter because of your
Oh,
share.
because of your
And I'm just
share.
like,
Yes.
those are I'm very incentivized by those. To me, I'm like, I should be posting about other people all the time. But like the whole dark academia community online is really about people longing after, sometimes fetishistically, but sometimes in a very sincere way, a certain kind of intellectual community and this feeling that like you get to live a life that is about the world of ideas. You get to live a life where you're constantly discovering new things, where you're having like these very meaningful, rich discussions where like all the people around you are interested in your intellectual development as a person. And then their intellectual development is also positively impacting yours. I think that fantasy of a certain kind of like liberal artsy, like hashtag dark academia y environment, that's what I really crave so much. And, I went and did a master's for it, but like you can't stay in grad school forever. And I thought about doing a PhD. And then eventually I was like, no, for me, it's not the right decision, but I want to exist in that world. How do I exist in that world? Like maybe for the rest of my life. And so this feeling of like constantly speaking to other people and taking other people's ideas, like some random commenter, that person could be just as intellectually serious as someone who has a massive following and is more obviously, I don't know, a public intellectual. I think to me, that's part of creating that environment.
Yeah, totally. Part of why I became so excited about writing online was a sense that I wasn't finding the intellectual communities that I hoped for within these institutional contexts. I also want to ask a bit more about your views on AI. I mean, we've talked about the sort of
Mm,
social
yeah.
media and the forum eras of the internet. Now everyone is very concerned with generative AI and with LLMs and slop, right? Like, I feel like in culture communities, the primary perception of AI is like a, it's like stealing our stuff, and B, the stuff it's creating is mediocre slop. I think I read somewhere in one of your pieces that you actually hypothesize that perhaps increased use of LLMs will only increase the urgency and the relevance of key
Yeah.
humanistic skills. And I also really enjoyed your AI art piece where you talk about how human artists are using AI and appreciating the quirks of the format in its own way. These are pretty hot takes. I'm like curious, like to talk broadly about your views on AI and also especially like how you bridge these identities, I guess, as
Mhm.
someone who is in both these tech communities that might be more optimistic, as well as a lot of literary and culture communities that are very suspicious of these things.
I do think of myself as a contrarian optimist in many ways, but dispositionally, I'm like, but what if things could be good? Like, what if things could actually be better in the future? With AI, I think it's quite worth teasing apart maybe the economic impacts from the kind of artistic impacts. I think actually you had an interview where you kind of made this very astute observation that when people say, like, oh, AI can never replace an artist, can never write a poem, can never do something at a certain level, they're making this statement about the quality of output that AI will ever be able to develop. And I think you made the observation that often this is really an economic anxiety masked as a creative or artistic anxiety. And so I think the economic anxiety is the part where I'm really sympathetic to the more kind of like AI skeptic or like AI oppositional stance where, so many of these models rely on massive data sets in order to produce these results that feel like magically intelligent. And if you're someone who like blogged for years online, or if you're like a random Reddit commenter who like wrote, I don't know, like all these guides on how to travel to Japan and make a travel itinerary. And then years and years later, you are like this tiny slice of a data set that gets brought into an LLM. And so when someone types in a request that's like, I'm planning a 10-day trip to Japan, like, what city should I go to? Like, some of your work is going into that. We don't have a sense of like how to value those contributions. Like, you have these AI companies that are valued at billions. Like, what does that mean for everyone else? So that's one part of the economic picture. And then I think the other part of the economic picture. So this idea I'm actually borrowing from the critic B.D. McClay, who has a really good Substack notebook and also does like really incredible literary criticism. But she has this newsletter post about ecosystems where she talks about how there's real like capital A art. And then there's a lot of just like commercial art or just like random roles where people are not making cutting edge contemporary art, but they're making commercial art that pays the bills, that lets them fund the other things. To me, the question of can AI write like a Pulitzer level poem or like a Nobel level poem, that to me is not the interesting question. It's more like, where do all the human poets make their money? Are they working as copywriters? Are they able to sustain a living that helps them create their artistic works?
It certainly feels like things are getting bleaker. I also wonder if we have ever had an ecosystem where people were doing real art, not the commercial art, not just the copywriting, but the experimental, the fine arts, etc.
Mhm.
Like that has rarely been something that you could sustain as a full-time living ever. I mean, before Substack, people would blog every
Yeah.
day for free for many years and influence tons of people, and everyone just had a day job that was something else, right? And we and our friend Sean like went to that day jobs exhibit down in Palo Alto where it was about artists making art inspired by the day jobs they had, and sometimes it wasn't even in a creative field, right? It'd be like, "I like stock boxes at the grocery store. I am a computer programmer." And sometimes I wonder if that is a more healthy and sustainable way to approach the question of economic sustainability. I sometimes feel that, like, if your day job is too close to your creative work, it actually drains the same pool of creativity, and it can, in a way, be better to have a day job that is totally unrelated. My friend Mills, who is the head of design at Substack and also writes a lot, he for a very long time was a Tumblr philosophy blogger where he would write an essay every single day. And he did this
Oh my
while
God.
working, I
I
think,
didn't
at a
know this.
home working at a Home Depot call center, which is not a super intellectually and demanding or an engaging job. But in a way, he's described it to me as it was quite symbiotic because it was also such a mindless job that he had all of this creativity and like intellectual energy that was bottled up. He could think about things in the back of his head while doing his day job and then sit down and like bang out his essays. It is unfortunate, but maybe we should accept that the super creative stuff is for the vast majority of people going to have to start out not being the main thing. And we got to learn some job to pay the bills.
I love this anecdote about Mills, who's a designer I very much admire. But yeah, this is something I'm really thinking out loud about. When people talk about like an ideal world that would produce like really great art and really great literature, it can be framed as like we should just have a society where more people can be full-time experimental artists and novelists and stuff like that. And I think the thing I always get stuck on is like, how do you choose like who those people get to be? You know, who's deciding who's the genre defining, groundbreaking artist? Like in the past, you would have like tenure track positions or fellowships where people could kind of be like shielded from the market and they could do their work. And that isn't necessarily the most democratic way of allocating prestige, time to create these things, because I think the internet has destroyed a lot of the ways to fund full-time cultural critic positions. But it has also created this like publishing environment and this media environment where if you are a random person, you can write a review of an album, you can write a review of a book, you can disseminate it around. And I don't mean just in the vulgar sense of like, oh, everyone thinks they're a critic, even if they're writing like a 2-star Goodreads, like one-liner review. But like everyone can be a critic in the sense that like everyone has a chance to try to achieve a certain level of analytical excellence, like literary excellence, intellectual excellence. Democratization leads to a lot of slop, but then it also means that a lot of people get a chance to refine their slop into something that's really special and innovative. And so that's something I think about is like the tensions of publishing online, like democratization versus quality, and how in that fight, I very much am on the side of like everyone deserves a chance to try to do their like groundbreaking art and literary work.
I think that is the philosophy that tech and the internet promote is that like we can have more people in the arena, but we can also have these sorting algorithms and filtering algorithms to figure out which of it is really good. And sometimes it's going to be the people who are already famous and already credentialed and who have professional degrees in it. But sometimes it's going to be a so-called nobody who ends up coming out and succeeding. And I probably share a lot of your biases that the system is not a perfect one and comes with its own trade-offs, but I think it's super valuable to have more people in the mix. And there are technologies like algorithms, whatever, that you can use to bring and elevate people who never thought that they could make a career out of their creative work or who could be in the discourse and be engaging with credentialed people. I remember one of my biggest oh my gosh moments when I was in undergrad writing for the Medium blog or something. I think I cited a book by the New York Times author who I really admired. I just posted my blog and he came across it and actually started like engaging with my blog. He actually critiqued and corrected something, but in a very polite and welcoming way. And I was just so honored that this like serious person would even like engage with a college student's amateur medium
Yeah.
blog, right? I was like, oh my God, like you were talking to me, I think that was the thing that really made me feel that there was something special about the democratization component of the internet.
Yeah, and what I'm reading from your story too is maybe the sense of like it's really meaningful to be taken seriously as an intellectual and a creative, especially
Mm,
if you're starting out, especially when you have all these insecurities, like someone who you think of as kind of like a real person engaging with
totally.
you, talking about your work. I have all these kind of like little dorky moments like that where it's like Alexander Chi liked something I'd post on Substack notes. Like
Yeah,
sometimes I write these very long notes, and Alexander Chi is a huge inspiration for me. Like the way he writes his essays, the like rigor, like the seriousness that he devotes himself to literature and activism. So the fact that the internet makes these things accessible to you and makes you feel that someone takes you seriously, you're like, okay, so I'm allowed to keep on going. I'm allowed to keep on refining my craft. And sometimes the difference between someone who's a really excellent writer and someone who seems like clearly amateurish is just that the excellent writer was praised at the right periods
mm,
in their journey, received the right mentorship and encouragement to keep on going. I really find it precious that the internet can offer more of that encouragement to people. You don't have to
yeah,
shout into a void. You don't have to be like picked by a gatekeeper, be like brought into an institution before you're allowed to make your work. You get to make your work and see like, do people care about this? Is this resonating with people? Can other people see something in it that I didn't see initially?
right, right. I do want to turn back to the non-economic side of the AI
Oh,
question as
yes, yes.
well. You seem optimistic both about the creative things that you can create using AI, but also that in our culture more broadly, the proliferation of LLMs and even slop might make us more humanistic, more attentive. I'm curious to hear that fleshed out.
Okay, well, I am curious if I can defend it as well, because again, it's like the contrarian optimism thing, but do I actually feel there's an optimistic case? One of the interesting aspects about the widespread use of LMs is that now any bit of content that you come across online, you kind of have to be like, is this real? Any YouTube comment, any Reddit comment, any blog post, any Substack newsletter, you don't actually know. And so it's been interesting to see people get more into this practice of like extremely close reading to point out like, oh, there are certain tells, there are certain like phrase structures. It's not
Hmm.
this, it's this. And I find that really interesting because that kind of close reading is traditionally not something that like the average layperson is doing for any random text. It's like, is this actually driving people to kind of pull out more like what are the aesthetic signatures of AI in text, in images? So that's one argument, which again could be an overly optimistic one. I think the other one is that one of the reasons I find discussions about like the potential quality ceiling of AI not very convincing, I just feel that like it doesn't really make sense to hinge your argument against AI on the quality because we don't have a great sense of what quality bar AI will achieve in the future. And if you try to say something like, oh, AI literature will never be as good as human literature because of the quality of the output, I'm like, but what if the quality of the output changes? Are we like, okay, humans are obsolete now? But I do think with a lot of artwork, it's like the point is not really the artifact, the point is the entire story around it. Like so many literary works, we care about them because they were written by a particular person at a particular point in history. They're responding to like other writers of their time or other conditions. And especially if you
Totally.
think about capital L literature, capital A art, people do not buy art or like bid art up at Christie's because it looks good. It's also because of the kind of whole aura, the story, the way the career of the artist and the trajectory of the artist has been narrated. How is this artist positioned in relation to other artistic movements? Have they been collected by certain people or institutions? And so I think that aspect is the truly irreplaceable thing. And I
There's
think
also
another,
some art
oh
that
yeah,
I think that, like, you appreciate because you can see the effort, right? Sports is an obvious example, is like, the reason that you go and watch Olympic sprinters is not because you couldn't watch a machine move at a faster speed, it's because, like, the
yeah.
excitement of knowing these people have tried so freaking hard that they are, like, getting up day on day, that you watch their interviews, you have this sense of, like, "Oh my gosh, this is, like, people at the limits of human potential." Sometimes you just like see a visual art exhibit and you're imagining the amount of like craft and minute attention that
Mhm.
goes into like every single thread in a textile piece or every brushstroke. You look at a painting or you look at a sculpture and you see the time that has gone into it. And when I
Totally.
see art in person, that's the experience I have. I value it more highly because I am imagining all of the effort behind it. And LLMs change the amount of effort it takes to produce certain types of works, but my sense is that we will simply value that less and look for other things where we will notice the effort more or something. I also had a
Mm.
conversation with a writer friend yesterday, and she was saying that she actually feels like she writes in a more punk way because she wants to prove that her work is human. And what that means is she's looser with the rules of grammar. She is more experimental with her prose, not to an extent where it's like not readable, of course, it's still very readable, but her essays feel extremely human.
Yeah, totally. Okay, many, many, many thoughts to this. I think you're very right about kind of the things we will begin to look for in a lot of like art and design and craft context is stuff where you can see the mark of the maker. I think in a lot
Mm.
of different crafts, like in ceramics, in the Instagram famous cakes and like pastries that get passed around, in textiles, you see people really gravitate towards things that feel kind of like sloppy, where it's like the
Mm.
textiles that are a little bit like lumpy or like things that are dyed in a kind of uneven way instead of like the perfect machine dyed smoothness, or like cakes that are deliberately asymmetric or kind of the way the frosting is done. It seems very like naive and childish, but actually takes like a very practiced aesthetic hand. So I think people definitely be drawn to that. I think there's also this aspect of like in the age of AI, the parasocial relationship between the artist and the audience is the moat.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this will increasingly be like you see some social media feed, you care about like the person behind it. Are there videos
Mhm.
of them? Can you track them down elsewhere in the internet?
I mean,
Something
how
you
do you
said
think
about,
about this?
yeah.
Because I know we've talked about like how much of yourself and how much of your personal life you try to
Mm.
put into your work, and you don't really write memoir in your Substack, for example. So both knowing that parasociality is increasingly the mode, but also wanting to set certain boundaries around how much of yourself you put into that creative output. How do you navigate between that?
Okay, I'm going to throw in a random hot take that I haven't thought about
Okay.
that much. I feel like there's this period last year. Actually, maybe this has been happening for the last 5 years where people are constantly writing essays about like, oh, we're all being so performative online. Like this is a performance, that is a performance. I think I have this feeling that constructing a persona that expresses your interests, your taste, something about who you are, but is not actually you, like is not
Mm.
actually, sitting in a room talking to you. All of that is inherently constructed, and there's always an artifice behind it. There's always some kind of selection of like, what am I going to include or exclude? And when you look at a lot of old advice from like Vivian Gornick and other memoirists about how to be a writer, they talk about this aspect of having to like create a persona on the page, especially with
Mm.
nonfiction, like this person that is not specifically you, that's not like the unmediated version of you. It's a deliberately constructed you for the purposes of telling a certain story or achieving a certain narrative outcome. And I think a lot of the stress about performativity comes from people not realizing that you can put up that shell. In my own writing, I feel I am writing about very personal things. Like research as leisure activity was kind of this manifesto of like, I want to be an amateur about things and take it seriously. I want to feel that there's something like intellectually justifiable about perceiving the world this way. So I do a lot of things where it's like there's this deep personal core that gets put into the work, but I am not necessarily writing about like, I opened up Instagram and I saw this person. I felt like vulnerable and terrible about it. There are like some forms of vulnerability that will kind of like hurt you if you put them out online because you aren't ironizing them. They're not like mediated enough or transmuted enough. But there are ways where you can take something that is so much a core of your experience and then transmute it into something where it feels like a cultural criticism piece, or it feels like an essay about a topic, even though it is about this like very intimate personal thing.
Yeah. I think the persona point is super interesting. I haven't thought about it that way before, where you are fostering maybe some parasociality, but that parasociality is with the creative persona that you have created
Right.
rather than with your whole self. I tend to write from a first person point of view. That is the easiest for me to do. It is the
Mhm.
way I prefer to write. It is what feels authentic. Everything I write about myself and my feelings are true. But like there are some parts of my life that I have cordoned away that I know will probably never be touched. My persona is a subset of who I am.
Okay, wait. This is going back a little bit to something you said
Mm.
earlier. You brought up that a friend of yours had mentioned like writing in a more punk manner. And I
Yeah.
do think something that still feels like very distinctively human because it's so hard for an LLM to do this is this like shift between registers, having a paragraph that is very like critical theory heavy, like art criticism, like very professional, very polished and confident. And then a paragraph after that that's more like conversational, like, oh my God, I saw this, like the abbreviations, the very like casual tenor. The critic Elvia Wilk, well, critic, novelist, she has a newsletter and I think she kind of perfectly lands at like constantly switching between registers. You're very formal, you're very serious. And I just think that LLMs are not that stylistically nimble because to attain that style or sentence by sentence range and also have it feel coherent, there are very few examples of doing it. So I think that will remain like a very distinctive, like human writing signature for a while.
Actually, one funny story that I heard about one of the AI labs was that at one point during the RLHF process, like getting human feedback on which responses are better, they asked raters to pick which response sounds more human. And they kept picking the ones with all the typos because humans
Yeah.
have typos and models don't. But then when they retrained the model based on this feedback, they ended up just producing a model that couldn't spell anything correctly. And
It's
so all it spit out was like prose that otherwise made sense, but was like just couldn't spell. Like every single word was misspelled. And then it took them ages to figure out that this particular
yeah.
human feedback was the reason that they had done this.
Yeah. This really makes me think of that classic, like the flaws of the medium become a signature thing,
Hmm.
where like, one of the reasons I am so on a personal level excited about AI in art is that this is just a funny, weird technology. It's very
Yeah.
complex. It produces all these like strange, like idiosyncratic, whimsical outcomes. And I think there's something about like artists being able to work in this very dynamic system and kind of deliberately pull out like what are the weird data biases? What are the weird kind of amplification effects? Like treating model collapse as something that can become artistically interesting and something that you can work with. I think there's a part of like this like Silicon Valley CS nerd part of me.
I did a podcast conversation with my friend Celine, who makes Poetry Camera, which, if people haven't
Oh my
seen
God,
it,
yeah,
it's
I love
like
that
a little
project.
Polaroid camera where you snap a photo and it prints out a poem that an LLM generates about what it sees. And she was saying, like, she loves the medium of an LLM in that context because it is the non determinism that makes it exciting, first of all. Like, it is part of the thing that you are going to get a different poem every time. And there's something fun to embrace about that aspect. But also, she was like, it is fundamentally a social experience. It's one about you reading the poem aloud to the other person and being able
Mhm.
to compare between the LLM's poem output and like what you are actually seeing in reality. And so even though like there could be a very narrow view that's like that's slop because LLM poems are slop, it is like very clear that there's something much deeper about embracing the fact that it's going to come out different every time, embracing the fact that the poem is not actually what you see in front of you. That is actually what makes that, I think, a very cool artistic invention.
I think the point about like, I think one, the like stochasticity of AI and then also the social aspect of it is so interesting. I mean, like with AI, one of the things people talk about as a flaw is like everyone's LLM could be giving them like totally different results when they ask a question, like who won the presidential election. That obviously has major stakes. But if you can treat that as a kind of interesting aspect of the medium, like, do you remember that trend a while back when people were asking LMs to like draw a picture of who you think I am, like in
Oh
my room or
yeah.
something like
Hmm.
that based on
Hmm.
my prompts? That is like taking the variability and the kind of personalized aspect of LMs and turning it into this social experience because people would post them, people would send them to their friends. I saw this really funny Substack note from Randa, who works at Substack, and I think she had
Mm-hmm.
a screenshot from like a granola transcript, and she was like asking like who had the funniest jokes in the
Oh
meeting,
my
and the
god,
transcript was like
that's
Randa
so
had
good.
some legitimately funny moments. I'm like, that is using AI to produce this whimsical social outcome.
Yeah.
That's great.
No, that's amazing. It's like you upload your entire group chat transcript to ChatGPT and you're like, can you like identify like who's the jester of
Yeah.
the group chat? Who's like always complaining? Like who
Yeah.
roasts the hardest? Like there's
Oh my
something
God, that
really
would be
funny to
so
that.
funny. Like doing these brackets where the AI is the one
Mm.
judging.
Totally.
I agree.
One broader question that I want to ask about that I was thinking about when I was reading your Asterisk magazine piece, which I loved. It's
Thank
titled,
you.
Is the Internet Making Culture Worse? So people should definitely read the whole thing. You talk about the alt weekly, the Village Voice, as the quote unquote Bell Labs of criticism, which is an analogy that I love. It made me wonder
Yeah.
more broadly, like, how do we measure progress or innovation in culture, which feels less obvious in how you look at progress in GDP growth or in technology.
One quick thought on this to connect this to something we were discussing earlier about existing in different worlds and trying to like use the language of those worlds. I felt so pleased when I thought of that, like the Village Voice is the Bell Labs of criticism thing, because I think what I was trying to do with the piece is like there's this one world that I have spent much of my life in, which is like the Silicon Valley tech STEM world. And then there's this world that I brute force my way into, which is the kind of like arts, humanities, cultural criticism world. And I'm trying to
Hmm.
make the case that like these are not two different worlds. These are not two different cultures that always have to be at loggerheads with each other. So I think that description is me trying to explicitly say we have a way of understanding excellence in the STEM world, which is like research labs, like Bell Labs. And then you go into this other world, and people do think of the Village Voice as kind of this foundational organization that had such a major influence on American politics, on American cultural life. So just kind of like trying to like use the terms of these different communities to kind of justify the value on either side. Now that I've said that, I forgot your question.
I mean, I think that was really useful. My question was how we measure progress or innovation in cultural domains.
I think the piece was mostly about me trying to answer this. I have seen all those articles that are like culture is stagnating, it's in
Hmm.
decline, like literature is worse than it was in the past, art is worse than it was in the past. And I think there's this real like epistemological problem trying to figure out if that's true because it's like I wasn't alive in the past when things were supposed to be good. So I'm trying to compare, I don't know, like me as a baby in the 90s to like me now as an adult in the 21st century. And then people who are alive in the 20th century and saw more of that. So it's just like whenever people make this claim of things are worse now than they were before culturally, you're kind of like, well, how do you make that claim? And so I think the theory I came up with first started from this perspective that I don't think people today are less creative or intelligent or ambitious or experimental than they were in the
Hmm.
past. I think that kind of idea of like, oh, people have just like degraded. People are just like worse now than they used to be. If anything, the world we live in now, there's so many more people who have access to the world's like greatest art and literature, have access to so many resources to learn about these things. To me, it doesn't make sense to say that people are making worse cultural and artistic works. So progress has to be about something else. It's not about like the quality of the works out in the world, but progress is really a feeling and a narrative. And so when we say that culture is progressing, it's because we have the right narrative that is like, this is improving, this is improving, this is improving. When we feel like we can't construct a coherent narrative of like, this artistic movement was succeeded with this one and with this one, and this medium was developing in all these new and exciting ways. That's what decline and stagnation is. It's not that everyone is suddenly mysteriously like dumber and less
Hmm.
creative. It's that we don't have that story. And then I was like, okay, well, why don't we have that story? Who is telling that story? Who's describing it? And I think that's where I come to my conclusion of the piece, which is that there are a lot of people creating art, but there's a difference between having people creating art and then having that labeled as like, this is an artistic movement. This is Fauvism. This is Cubism.
Hmm.
And, very often you do have artistic movements where like those people are writing a manifesto and saying like, this is who we are. This is what we're about. But I think another big aspect of it is like you have the movement and then you have all the people that are like contemporaneously writing about the movement, saying like people should pay
Hmm.
attention to this. And they're creating this secondary material that then becomes part of a historical narrative. Like if you put together an art exhibition and maybe a bunch of people are involved in it, it kind of feels like a bit of a movement. And then no one writes about it, no one takes any documentation. Like in 10 years, no one will know that existed.
Hmm.
And I think like that feeling of progress comes from a lot of people pointing to something and saying like this is not just an isolated set
Hmm.
of people, I don't know, like making their Substack posts, like publishing their
Yeah.
novels. This is something that is like a bigger zeitgeisty accumulation,
Yeah. In a
say.
way, cultural production today is like more documented than ever, right? Like on one hand, you probably won't have the exhibitions and the lack of oral histories and whatever because everything is being recorded and posted somewhere. Like there's almost always somebody who has taken a photo, who has posted the thing. And then for culture that is happening online, do you think that we are seeing fewer people doing that and making sense from the mass of data points that are on the internet? Or do you think that will come later? Like it's only going to be in a decade or 2 decades looking back that people will be able to characterize like the Substack lit crit as like a scene.
I have a loose thought. I think in terms of information landscape, we've probably moved from this period of scarcity to a period of excess. So like when you look at histories of the past, I think the main problem is that there's just not enough information. If you're a medieval historian or an early modern historian, it's like, how do you know what women were doing in that period if they weren't able to write or people who were working class, like never had their experiences recorded? When you look into the past, you're dealing with, I think in many cases, a deficit of data. And now, because so many ordinary people have access to publish things and write things and put their work out there, like we don't have this old historian problem of like you don't have enough information to write a history of below or like to write about all these different movements. Now we have this problem of like an excess of information and it's
Mm,
just a different problem. And so maybe in the past you had very few people who were able to publish a work of criticism that said that like this is a new movement and have it be
mhm.
distributed. But then if you were able to do that, you had a pretty good shot at like embedding that into the history books, let's say.
Yeah.
And now it's like everyone can publish, but
Mm,
all those different claims maybe are getting lost in this massive sea of information. And maybe it's hard for any one narrative to rise up to the top.
yeah.
I think there's this aspect too of like narratives need to attach to each other. Like when you think about like the idea of like girlhood or the idea of like heteropessimism, it was like you had a few breakout articles. And I just
Mm.
feel like we don't really have the kind of like focusing capacity to like turn these small bubbles into these bigger narrative trends.
One question that I've been thinking about a lot these days is how to do good culture writing. And I think it's
Mm,
because there's culture writing and then there's like trend pieces. One version of culture writing that I get tired by or I don't find as interesting is like, I saw 3 tweets about this and now I'm going to give it
oh
a
my God,
label and
yeah.
this is actually a movement, right? And like, there's a way
Yeah.
in which because everyone can produce things now, like people are labeling new trends and new movements and new subcultures all the time, right? But because it is happening all the time in excess, as you say, none of it really feels that important or that resonant. And culture writing really matters to me. But how do I do culture writing that is deeper than like the I saw 3 tweets trend piece? How do you do culture writing that, rises above the fray? And I'm curious if you have writers in mind who you think do this really well or how you think that culture writing can differentiate from the transient trend piece that can be churned out on mass scale.
Okay, this is interesting and a very difficult problem. A few thoughts while I try to get my way to some sort of definitive statement. One is that I am really annoyed by that kind of writing too. And I almost think of that as like, that is human produced slop. Like, well before AI slop was a
Totally.
problem. We had all this like bad journalism, like all these
Yeah.
bad listicles. But I found this really amazing newsletter where this guy wrote something that was like, so when is AI supposed to take my job? And he
Mm,
was talking about how like AI could not replace a certain form of journalism, which is like going, interviewing
mhm.
people, developing a rapport with them, bringing like new data that like doesn't exist in a
Yeah.
data set into a piece of writing. And he's like, AI can't do that. But it
Mhm.
can do a lot of like the shitty listicle writing.
Yeah.
And he has this line where he's like, like AI can do that work, but like humans should have never been doing that work in the
Mm.
first place. Like,
You
yeah,
could probably literally take any 3 tweets, random 3 tweets, put them into ChatGPT and be like, generate me like a
a trend
500
piece.
word trend piece about this. And it would find a way to do that from 3 tweets. I guarantee it.
Oh my God. I feel like there's some good like concept, like single purpose website that's like, is this AI slop or is this human produced
Oh
slop?
God.
One also like personal reaction I have to this is like, so I haven't opened TikTok in like 2 or 3 years, but I think because I'm not on TikTok, I notice how many trend articles are just like some algorithmic blip that apparently everyone is seeing on TikTok for that week. And everyone feels
Right.
this extremely strong, powerful need to write about like thought daughters and how performative they are or
Mm,
something like that.
mhm.
And I'm like, is this a real thing? Why is everyone talking about this? And then like 2 weeks later, it's not a real thing. And I'm like, you guys, why did you show me
Yeah.
that content?
Yeah.
It's like, are we really going to pick up like every random like trad wife trend on TikTok and be like, what does this say about feminism in the 21st century? Maybe it says absolutely nothing. Maybe it's like two or three
Yeah.
people made some, vapid content.
Maybe
And
it's like
there's not like
the
the
ML
bigger.
engineers shipped like a minor algorithm update and it accidentally started amplifying tradwife content slightly more. And like now we've decided that like some new
It says
algorithmic
something about
update or
society.
quirk. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I'm like, actually it doesn't. But it's hard because I don't want to be one of those people who's like, the internet is not real life. Because as we know, like the internet is a shaper of culture. But what is that line? And how can we, as people who are to some extent cultural critics, do work that goes beyond that?
This is making me wonder if part of the reason I kind of like ran off in the direction of like writing book reviews. I think it is really hard if your beat is like internet cultural criticism to do the things that are consistently influential and consistently speak to something greater. Like I think part of the success of Gia Tolentino's like first essay collection and like her essays on like Instagram face and stuff like that came
Mm,
about because she was able to take a few like Instagram posts and really actually pull out this like bigger, broader
mhm.
argument. I don't know if part of it is like, yeah, it's hard. You don't have a sense of scale. Maybe some of it
Yeah.
is the pressure to publish regularly.
You also
I
have to
actually
go
think,
outside. Like, Gia goes outside, and so, like, she can look at the trend online and know whether or not, like, Instagram Face is a thing that actual people are doing that is coming up, like, in real life conversations. I was on the East Coast last week, is people ask me whether particular Twitter trends they see coming out of SF Tech Twitter are real.
I like
Like,
real,
are
yeah.
people actually 996ing, or are they just saying that? Do people actually think Cluely is a good company, or are they just saying that? And, like, if you are not in the culture beyond the internet layer, like, you will not have like good enough antibodies to know whether or
Mm,
not it's a one-off viral thing that says nothing deeper, whether or not it's bait. It's like so many of the tweets are bait, and there are people tweeting about American politics who do not live in America, and they are distorting our view of what our fellow citizens believe. And good culture writing has to come from being both an observer and a participant
mm.
who can vibe check how much did this random viral video actually say about the way that we live together.
I think that's actually a great point. If it's just something that's on TikTok for a few weeks, like that's not a real trend. But if it's something where it's like this TikTok thing testifies to this like real life practice that is
Mhm,
shaping how people live, then maybe that's something that's more significant because it is something about like culture more broadly and not just like what is one particular app's algorithm showing to a
mhm.
few subsets of people.
When I was writing my like piece about bait and bike signaling, I was trying to decide
Mhm.
whether I was taking the bait by even writing
Yeah.
about these companies because I don't think that most companies in
Mm,
Silicon Valley are doing this. But then I was sort of like, I think the way for me to write about it is to not take it at face value of like they are saying they're going to take all our jobs, therefore they are going to take all our jobs. But like, what is the political economy of the startup scene right now that
mm,
incentivizes these startups to run these crazy billboards all the time? And
yeah.
to me, that feels like that was my justification of like, okay, this is like a little bit of a deeper piece than me just like doing a trend piece and taking the
And be
bait
like, "What's
by
up with
posting
this?"
about it. I
Yeah.
don't know.
I have to say, framing it as bait is actually really, really revelatory for me. Literally, just before signing on to talk to you about this, I was reading this post where someone was like, in the Netherlands, there are all these AI generated songs that are trending on the Spotify charts, and they have like AI generated, like very anti-refugee lyrics.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, wow,
Hmm.
this is so interesting and insidious. And then I looked at the comments, and a lot of people are like, wait, are real people streaming this? Like, is the concern that like real people in the Netherlands are like constantly streaming like anti migrant AI generated music? Or is it that there are bots streaming bot created music to create this trend
Mm,
that will
mhm.
then create this whole like, this whole wave of like
Oh,
takes being like, oh my God, like what's happening? Like,
yeah.
are people in the Netherlands like becoming more anti-migrant? Is there like more hostility? Your framing of bait made me think of is like, are people kind of intentionally exploiting this kind of like culture journalism, hot take way of like surveilling the
Yeah.
internet and trends and being like, oh, this must speak to something deeper.
Mhm.
And then like to what degree can that be engineered? So you can like create a totally manufactured trend.
Right. Like, it's a whole dead internet theory thing where it is possible that both sides of it are bots. I also think of when celebrities will have, like, PR relationships or influencers will stage dramas with each other where both people are in on it, right? We can consume that as a form of entertainment, but at the point where we start to think, like, yeah, this is actually how people treat each other, these are real things that we can, like, draw broad conclusions from, that's the point at which I'm like, we are taking the bait, and human writers might be buying into amplifying some of these more unsavory trends just out of like a lack of discernment.
Yeah, totally. It's almost like this makes me think of like, like show boxing and how you have these like totally constructed matches. And it's almost like we are now in this media environment where you can have these totally constructed fake matches between like one bot army, another bot army.
Mm-hmm.
They can be weaponized to create these like political debates or these cultural
Yeah.
debates, which may not even be real, but it's like we are the audience. We're all kind of like conscripted
Yeah.
into this fantasy.
A
Like
lot
the
of
real world.
Republican
Yeah.
culture war stuff is that for a long time, Republicans couldn't win on economic issues because their economic policies were unpopular and you cannot get a majority of the voter base to vote with you. So you have to shift the terrain onto what are partly real and partly manufactured cultural issues so that you can actually get more than 50% of the vote.
Years ago, an ex of mine said something which I found very insightful. He was basically like, on the internet, there's no such thing as like a straw man argument because you have this
Hmm.
idea of like someone will set up a straw man argument. And you're like, that's not something a real person would say. But like, there's always someone who's like unhinged enough
Yes.
online
Oh my
to say
gosh.
that argument. And if you are a very transphobic organization, you can definitely
Mm.
find like one real trans person
Hmm.
who states this viewpoint in a way which is like so outre, so beyond what like most people believe. And you're like, oh, that's everyone in the community.
Hmm. I want to be conscious of time
I
and we are
just,
nearing the end. So I want
yeah.
to ask you a bunch of questions about your writing life. So to start, how do you use social media today?
So I controversially am pro social media. For most of my 20s, I was like, I can't be on Instagram. It's going to make me paranoid. It's going to give me body dysmorphia, all these things. And then I was kind of like, social media is how people meet other people who have their very niche interests, who may not be geographically near them or who may not already be part of their social circles. So about 2 years ago, I was like, I should be using Instagram more. I should be like using Twitter more. To be honest, the only social media I'm really using quite regularly is Substack because I'm text oriented and there's no
Mhm.
character limit on Substack,
That's true.
which is a blessing for me. But I do think that it helps to be like on a kind of personal version of social media where it's like if you are writing about art, you just make all of your social media about contemporary art and like art
Mhm.
critics and like new
Yeah.
art releases. And you create this funneled world that just like totally reinforces the thing you're trying to do. And I think that's very much what I've done with social media.
Mm. It's kind of a vehicle for aspiration in the Agnes Keller
Mm.
sense, right? Like you
Yes.
can decide like
Yes.
this is the sort of person I want to be. That sort of person would consume this type of content. Let me go and like follow a bunch of podcasts and Instagram accounts and whatever
Yeah.
and
And
immerse
then
myself
become
in that
that
until I
person.
am that kind of person.
Yeah.
How do you use AI?
Well, I do use AI for a lot of vibe coding, which is very fun for me because I'm someone who had this CS degree that I basically never used. I sort of learned how to use JavaScript and then like modern contemporary web development standards have really passed me by. So now I'm like, okay, thank God. I never had to learn that shit after all. I'm just going to make AI build my React apps. So that has been quite fun. I have tried to use it for writing with mixed results. I'm a control freak, so I never use it to write like the final sentences.
Mhm.
But I was initially like, oh, can I use AI for researching sources? And I found that like it only works for a certain type of source because if you're a writer, I think even the sources you're referencing are a way of demonstrating your taste. It's like the
Totally.
particular reference points, the juxtaposition. Like I really enjoy the pieces where I'm like, I'm going to take this philosophy book and I'm going to take this sociology book and like I'm going to take, this like history of technology book. It's like fun to pull things from unexpected worlds into the
Mhm.
same world of a piece. And so when that becomes a really important part of taste, then it's like you have to prompt AI so excessively.
They might as well
So
just do it also.
yeah, I do use it for a lot of like, take this bit of text, fact, like list every claim, fact check it for me. If I've written
Mm.
anything wrong, provide like three different versions and explain to me why they're more factually correct.
Oh,
Insanely
I do that
helpful.
too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The fact
Yeah.
checking thing is so useful because again, people talk so much about the hallucinations, but I'm like, I make shit up all the time, like on accident, to
I
be
myself am
clear.
hallucinating.
Right. I
Yeah.
am always hallucinating things. And so like sometimes like I'll be like, this sounds true to me, but I can tell that I actually haven't done the research. But it's just like one sentence in my piece. And I'm like, okay, let me just like make sure that what I'm saying is correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually think AI is amazing for like, I'm going to write an extremely factually dense sentence that is going to
Hmm.
be pre AI, like 2 hours of research to compress that
Hmm.
in. And then with AI, it's like 10 minutes. And then I like check the AI sources and then I have
Yeah,
my
right.
fact.
So we talked a lot about Substack, but you also do write for magazines and more traditional
Hmm.
literary publications. What role do Substack versus magazines play in your writing career?
I know some people who are like obviously all in on the magazine side and they don't do like serious pieces on their Substack. Like their
Hmm.
Substack is like personal or discoursey. There are people who obviously are like all in on Substack and are kind of like the gatekeepers are annoying, like editors are annoying. You don't get a large audience that way. I kind of want to do like serious essays in both domains, but I guess I would say, I mean, with magazines, the lead time is a lot longer, which I think is good in many ways because I think sometimes you just need time to mature. Like an
Hmm.
idea that I've been working on for 3 months is deeper than one that
Hmm.
I've done in 3 weeks. The Substack ones are always 3 week long ideas because at some point I'll be like, you know what, I should just publish this. I should just send
Yeah,
it out and move on.
totally.
And I think when I'm writing for a publication, I have this feeling of like, first, I want
Mm.
to impress the editor. knowing that I am reaching that specific audience first, who will be reading it very deeply and comprehensively and critically, just like pushes my work to another level. I would say too that like all of the editors I've worked with have really taught me something about writing. Like the first book review I published was with the Cleveland Review of Books, which I love as a publication. And my editor there, he would just like make these like little directional edits that were so, so incredibly helpful for me and shaped like every other book review I've done. And so I think I think one of the reasons I'm most sad about the economic model for cultural criticism and newspapers collapsing is just that like being edited is how you learn as a writer.
Mhm.
For a nonfiction writer, like if you get edited by a bunch of really good people, that's kind of equivalent to a creative writing MFA. But if there
Mm.
aren't enough people who can be full-time editors making money, then how are you going to get that training? I
I
guess
remember
that's
I
how I see
asked
it.
Sean if I was like, Sean, do you have any nonfiction writing workshop recommendations that I should sign up for? And he was like, you should just pitch because then an editor will pay you to learn. And I was like,
Yeah.
whoa.
Yeah, and you're like, ah. The problem, of course, is the pitching. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
that's like the main reason why I think I enjoy writing on Substack is like I think it's good actually to have some level of gatekeeping because it forces your ideas to rise on another level. But it's like you pitch things, you may not get a response. That's very
Mhm.
demoralizing. My friend Wendy Liu, who wrote like Abolish Silicon Valley, we have
Yeah.
been talking about starting a rejection spreadsheet and setting rejection
Ooh.
goals. So we'll
Mhm.
like text each other and we'll be like, we should pitch this place and get rejected. We should pitch this place and get rejected. And it's a nice
That's
way of
cute.
reframing what is the most demoralizing part of pitching,
Mhm.
which is like
Yeah.
people might never write you back.
I know. I hate pitching. Legitimately think that like my hatred of pitching is the main reason that I don't freelance more than all of my like philosophical things about legacy media and whatever. I'm like, no, I actually just hate pitching. It
This
sucks
part
to
is
spend many
annoying.
hours writing up an idea to get zero response back. I
Yeah.
want to ask about the design of your Substack posts. Like you use numbered lists, you use images or quotes or tags. Like, yeah, how do you think about that?
Okay, so one thing I will say is I'm a markdown freak. I love markdown. So
Mm,
all of my like personal notes are just like intensively formatted. I do the like block quotes, I do the like lists and
wow.
things like that. I write really long newsletters and I
Hmm.
really think a lot of people read to the end. I have this like Proust newsletter that went viral earlier this year. I think it's something like 5,000 words. Actually, a lot of people read to the end. I have like comments, I have like emails that reference
Hmm.
like things that are like deep into the post. I'm like, okay, people are really
Yeah.
reading this. I feel very strongly that like people can read something long form on their phones, but like it's very easy to get bored. And so a
Mhm.
lot of the formatting I do is like I just want it to feel as visually varied as possible. Like lists are like a nice visual break, block quotes, nice visual break, having generous images throughout, having a few short paragraphs, a few long ones. Sometimes I see newsletters where I'm like, the content in this is so good, but there are no images.
Yeah.
There are no like subheadings, there are no like little lists or
The
horizontal rules, and
paragraphs
like
are too
every
long. Like
yeah,
the
and, like, every
paragraphs take
paragraph
up
is
the
the
entire
same
screen on your
size.
phone. Yeah.
Yeah, I think visual variation is how you get people to read
Mm.
long form on a screen.
No, that makes sense. The longest thing I wrote was like this post about China, and I think it was
Mhm.
7,000 words.
Okay,
But
but I read
I
that in one sitting. I will say this.
thank
I
you.
read it
I'm
all in
very
one
happy to
sitting.
hear that. No, somebody else also like messaged me and she was like, I love that post. It's so brisk. And I was like, brisk is not the word
Like
I would have
7,000?
used.
Yeah.
Because it is 7,000 words and most things I write are not that. But my logic there was if I just put some travel photos in between every few paragraphs, then maybe it will be okay and no one will notice.
To what I was saying at the very beginning about, like, the importance of headings and having a clickbaity headline to package your thing, I'm also like images, breaking up, like, visually breaking up a long bit of text. That is how you get people to absorb this extremely long form, complicated argument.
Okay, last real question, which is that you love self-help. Lots of people look down on self-help. Tell me why you love self-help.
It is kind of cringe, but I just really believe in the capacity to transform yourself. So I think like self-help is founded on this idea that if you don't like who you are, if you don't like something about yourself, you can change it and you don't have to kind of throw up your hands and be like, I just have these flaws, I have these sensitivities, I have these anxieties and I'll never get over them. I think maybe it's because I went through this period as a child where I was like incredibly, incredibly shy, like never spoke to people. Kind of like my hands would get very sweaty. I'd feel like very panicked. My heart would start beating faster if I was like called on in class to answer something. And so I think the transition from being that person who was just like so compulsively shy to someone who I've, I feel like I can talk to random strangers if I go to a reading and I'm just kind of like, I want to make new friends. I think the fact that I went from someone who was compulsively afraid of sharing my writing online, was always afraid it would never be good enough, and was always like so fearful and kind of like ashamed and in this shell to someone who like now I share a lot of my writings all the time compulsively. Yeah, I think I believe in self transformation. I think self help is the thing you read if you just want to convince yourself that it's possible. You're constantly ingesting this propaganda that you can change in the ways you want to change.
I think that I believe in self transformation is a really good way to end. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Celine. Where
Thank you
online
for
can
having
people
me.
follow your work?
It is pretty much all on my Substack, personalcanon.com. And then sometimes I'll write in other places, and then I will send out a little newsletter, sometimes delayed by a week or two because they're always pointlessly long about what I'm up to. That's the main thing.
Awesome. Okay, yes. Please sign up for Celine's newsletter. If you enjoyed this episode, please send it to a friend. And you can find full transcripts and links and other unrelated essays at jasmine.substack.com. Thanks so much, Celine.
Yes, thank you. This is great.